Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon in case you are joining from Europe or Africa. We welcome you to this webinar on how to calculate emissions reductions from mitigation actions. We will wait 2 more minutes to allow a few more people to join. Feel free in the meantime to change your name to reflect the city you represent or the organization, so we can see who is here, because that's always nice. Nice to see people joining. We will start in a second. Could I ask perhaps Yoshi to post a link to the webinar program in the chat in case you want to sign up for more webinars while you are waiting? Thank you, Siri. All right, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon in case you are joining from Europe or Africa. We welcome you to our webinar on how to calculate emissions reductions from mitigation actions. And you can switch slide, Björn. Just a few hygiene logistics checks before we start. Feel free to add your name of the city or organization you're representing. Keep yourself muted, and do note that we offer interpretation into Spanish or English depending on what language you prefer. You click on the globe that you should have in the menu list, or ask someone in the chat if you don't know how to do that. And please use the chat throughout the webinar to exchange among yourselves, ask questions or similar. Let's go. But first, I wanted to take a second to introduce you to the One Planet City Challenge. This webinar series has been designed exclusively for our participants, and we're really happy to see so many here today. We are now opening up the challenge for new admissions, and that also means that if you were a part of the last round of the challenge, you now need to report again to the CDP eClay platform and click to join the initiative in there. You can always connect with your national office if you don't know how to do that. What we want to do with the challenge here at WWF is to democratize global scientific results, for example, from the latest IPCC report. And by that, we mean that we want to make them easily accessible and relevant to all local governments across the planet. We mainly do this in our individualized strategic feedback report. We mean that joining the IPCC is a way to be a part of the global cities arena. We try to keep you informed about that. And it's a way to stand up and be counted in support of the Paris Agreement and the global climate negotiations. This is why we like to celebrate frontrunners through solution stories and our awards, and use this movement as a way to accelerate the global climate transition. We try to collaborate with all the main city initiatives, and we were happy to see in our participant survey of the last round that 83% like to join again and 86% were ready to recommend us to peers. And since it's our job to basically hurry you up and tell you to do more than you're already doing, we are very happy to be able to deliver that and still be perceived as adding some value for you and not just being stresses. All right, so now this webinar series, we call it the building blocks of a plan in terms of mitigation actions. And so we have different webinars that touches upon all of these cornerstones that it takes for you to have a decent plan. It's also connected to our assessment framework that you use when you report to the OPCC. So we have one webinar on city emissions inventories. For those of you who still need to know where your emissions come from and how they are distributed over different sectors, which is a nice basis and also connected to today's webinar on how to calculate the effects of the actions that you are about to undertake. We recently had a webinar on science-based targets, how to set targets that reflect your fair share of the Paris Agreement. That is now on our YouTube channel, so check that out in case you missed it. Then next webinar here from us will be about impactful mitigation actions, specially designed around the Latin American context. It is possible also that our national offices in the LAC region offer you peer-based coaching where you can sit together with a smaller group of cities and exchange more deeply around these topics. So check that out as well. And today's webinar is I'm particularly fond of it because I do feel that if you don't know what the effect will be of your actions, it can be really difficult to talk to your management, to your citizens, or get acceptance for your work within the city. So I'm glad to have Björn and Carol here to speak to you about it today. Over to you.
Thank you, Victoria, for that introduction. Splendid, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to the important work of cities all around the world. I will do the best to give a crash course. This can be a large question, but a crash course can get you started and then take step by step to develop your work in calculating emission reductions. We help you. We think this is the way to help you get started or improve. And I would say that in line with what Victoria said, it's of course important to know a little bit about emission reductions, to know if you are meeting your targets, for example, and if you are dealing with your largest and most significant emissions of your city. Let's have a look on that. So you see the wheel and the cornerstones for a systematic work in the upper right corner. And when do you do the calculation actually? Well, I think that you will do that in order to evaluate and consider what actions you want to do and what actions you want to focus on. You can do many actions, but what are most impactful? And try to work with these actions. So you build your mitigation plan with the actions that you calculate in order to see if you can meet your climate mitigation target, or how far you will get to your target and what more you need to do. Then, of course, you want to present your chosen actions and tell people about, yes, we think that this will be the impact of our actions. And summarize all the actions that you have calculated to show that if this is how far this is helping you towards your targets, your climate mitigation targets. Then you want, of course, to follow up the action plan and evaluate further actions. Should we continue? Should we do something more? Something else? And of course, you want to report your emission reductions when reporting actions to the One Planet City Challenge on the CDP eClay track. So summarizing, calculate emissions actions when building your strategy, when and choosing and building your strategy plan, and then when you are implementing your mitigation action plan, and then evaluating to take the next step. The questions in the CDP eClay track is question 9.1, and we encourage you to report your most significant mitigation actions that you are doing or planning to do. All right, so this is the basic. Calculating emissions actions are helpful for you all along your systematic work and will enhance and help you reaching your targets and combating climate change. I'm gonna talk about the global standard, which is helpful for you to use. I'm gonna talk how the importance of connecting your actions and how you calculate them towards how you have calculated your emission inventory so that they match. We'll give you basic method with an example. We talk about other impacts than carbon greenhouse gas reductions. There are other impacts as well. And then we have the Cantu City presentation. That's going to be very interesting to listen to. And then we wrap up with maybe some more thoughts on how to calculate and I'm gonna in the end gonna wish you all luck, but let's come back to that later on. So are you ready? Let's see then. There is actually a quite helpful standard method with a guide from World Resource Institute. It's called Policy and Action Standard, and it is helping and guiding exactly what we are trying to do in the city, try to calculate the impact of action on the society level or the government as a whole, the community level. Here we're not talking about a specific organization, but we're talking about the city as a community. And here is the guide to help you be transparent and move forward in trying to account for more actions and calculate more actions. It works for any kind of action or policy, really. It's a good help, I think. I have used it in order to draw up this presentation today. We can also point to a additional helpful standard which from Mission Innovation, which is a global cooperation of governments and authorities and other non-governmental organizations. They are doing a guide for innovation and how to calculate impact from a new innovation. It has similarities to how on how to calculate a general action on the community level. So be a little bit careful, but it is helpful also to read that one if you have time. Otherwise, you will be fine with the policy and action standard from World Resource Institute, which align to the global protocol, global greenhouse gas protocol. All right. Let's see. I talked about that we need to match and think about calculating action reduction, emissions reductions in connection to the emission inventory of your city emissions that you do. And just to, as Victoria said, there will be a webinar on this in June, which will explain more in depth how you do an emission inventory. but let me say just that the One Planet City Challenge and WWF recommends you to do an emission inventory that considers scope 1 and scope 2, direct emissions in your locally and your grid supplied energy, and that you account for all 5 sectors: transport, agriculture, energy, and so on. Depending on how your emission looks like, you want to match actions with your reported emissions. You want to have the same system boundaries. You want to talk about the same thing. So we don't start talking about apples and pears when we should talk about really apples. So where you have your significant emission sectors, if your largest emission sectors are energy and agriculture, then you will need to have, should be that you have significant actions calculated for these sectors. And several actions maybe, but we do think that it's good to have actions for each sector, but a more smaller sector, you maybe have fewer actions. But the important thing here is that if your city does not report emissions for a certain scope or greenhouse gas, if you don't report methane as a greenhouse gas in your emission inventory, you cannot include methane when you calculate a specific action, because then you will have a mismatch or double count when you compare your actions to your baseline emissions. So example, if you have not reported scope 3 emissions, that is upstream's emissions, in your calculation, you cannot include these in your action calculation. Do you think about system boundaries? We come back to that. Right, let's see. There is a helpful in the CDP eClay track today. Nowadays, there is an appendix C with a lot of list of standard actions, and it's good if you like find the action, some of the standard actions that meet the actions that you do. There are always the choice other, of course. In the appendix C, the actions are grouped into like 8-9 groups, and I think it's a little bit good to think about how the action relates to the different sectors in your emission inventory. So of course you have stationary energy actions that will be primarily sector 1, transportation sector 2, waste, etc. There is also generation of grid supplied energy actions, and there is a group of food actions, and these can be mindful that these actions can be either for sector 1, stationary energy, or it can affect transportation or agriculture, and not only agriculture. Right. So when you have an idea of your actions, some things to think about is that as a start on how to do this, I think it's good to say that there are actions that are easier to calculate, and there are other actions that are a little bit more tricky, and we're going to see examples from Kanto City on this. More easy actions are if you're working with energy, you replace one energy source with another energy source. They're quite simple calculations. But if you are more talking about trying to improve walking or biking, it will be a more tricky thing. But let's come back to that. Nonetheless, it's worthwhile trying to start to calculate and then step by step improving. Right. So how do you do this then on more basic thinking? Where do you start? Well, let's start to identify the situation. And then it's good that you start with saying, what is the situation before you intervene, before you do something? What is the present situation? So here in this example for this action, we think that we have a power plant in the city that is fueled by coal. So the action is you want to shut down the coal power plant and replace it with some other renewable energy like wind or solar power. So after your action, you have electricity produced by solar and wind instead. So basically you take the emissions before your actions and minus the emissions that you will have after the action, and the differences will be your emission reduction, the impact in reduction of greenhouse gases. Now, how big this impact will be is, of course, determined by the action itself you do, but it also will be determined by what is your system boundaries and how much will you include in your calculations. So I have a small table here that you can see scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And in this case, with power generation, it's always scope 2. And the major pre-action emissions, of course, burning coal. Afterwards, the direct emissions in scope 2 will be quite small. It might be the maintenance of wind and the solar utilities. But it might have quite an impact also, the change of power production for your transportation in your city, for scope 1 emissions for transportation. Transport of coal might be quite a lot of transportation, but transport of maintenance personnel will be quite small. And the idea is to think about what is big and what is small, and account for it or put it up, but maybe start accounting for the major emissions or the major impact. So not to be overwhelmed by having to calculate too much. There are other impacts than the direct impact of lowering carbon dioxide emissions. And it is good to, when you do the calculation and thinking of the action, evaluating the action, also have a look on the system impact, the long-term impact. Are we doing some structural change? If we are, good, then it's a great motivation to do this action. You should think about rebound. Actually, that when doing this, something unwanted can happen. Like we have the example of, if you do energy savings, you will save money, but maybe the money you save are used to invest in more energy use. Then you are back to square one again. So think about rebounds, but do think also about co-benefits. There will lower air pollution and a more attractive city maybe, but also be mindful of conflict of interest for the new solution. And when you have calculated carbon dioxide, usually when you're talking about energy, it's also good to actually have a look upon what is the energy impact in terms of energy savings or larger share of renewable energy generation. Right. Let's see if this can be helpful, this overview. So what I said is, what is the situation before your action? What is it after your action? And that the difference is your greenhouse gas reduction impact. So in this case, you have a coal power plant, changes to wind and solar, you will get lower emissions. But how much? Well, you need to find out an emission factor for burning coal, and you need to find out an emission factor for producing electricity by wind and solar. There is no local direct emissions from wind and solar, but there are of course emissions from the production of these. But in this example, I made it very simple and put 0 here. Just for the example, you might want to do differently. So the difference then in terms of the emission factor is quite big. But you will need also to know how much energy is produced, and to see the full impact of emissions, you need to multiply the emission factor with activity data, that is the energy production on a yearly basis for both of these production methods of electricity. And why do there you can also have, maybe you need to think in different actions that different productions might be different efficient, so you would need to take that in consideration when calculating. So next step, final step, take the emission factor times, multiply it with the activity data, and you will get your emissions before actions. Do the same with what you replace with, emission factor times activity data. You get the emissions from the new situation. Do the difference, calculate the differences, and you have the impact in greenhouse gas emissions reduction per year. Right. Be mindful, of course, of rebound, co-benefits, and conflict of interest impact. Something like this, the basic method schematic. Very simple. So this is just an example, not considering the complex reality. A major thing that to be able to do this, you need, of course, some basic data to do the calculations. What are, first of all, the activity data, the energy produced, or the electricity produced in megawatt hours, for example, or gigawatt hours per year. You will need the emission factor from fossil coal in this example, and from the production by solar energy or wind energy or hydropower, or what your choice is. Here you be mindful of that you can have emission factor for only emissions from the end of pipe, that is burning office, or at the actually production. That is usually scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But you also maybe would like to have scope 3 or upstream emissions or life cycle emissions. And that's fine, and that's usually very good. But be mindful that you then also need to include these in your emission inventory. So where do you find this data? I would say, and this can be different for different cities. We're gonna zone here from the Cantu city, how they do it. But total energy production, you all usually can find local data or from the utility itself. Usually national energy agencies has some numbers. The emission factors, I would recommend that you try to find it in nationally or regionally. And if there is not available, there will be the International Panel on Climate Change documentation will be helpful, but you need to be a little bit mindful. For upstream emissions, usually you will need to work with national handbooks or the environmental agency or energy agency. So that's a crash course. I'm sorry that was very a lot, maybe a lot of details up front. The webinar will be recorded, and you will have time to come back to the PowerPoint and so on and reflect. But from now, I don't know, Victoria, is there a question or some things that you would like to add or clarify something of what I said before we invite our guests?
And I think you put it out really nicely and simple as always, although the reality, of course, is complex. But I think that we should invite our city guests, and then we can take questions afterwards. We had a question around science-based targets, but we can get back to that later.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So, Cantu City, Vietnam. I invite Mrs. Chow Thi Kim Toa, Head of Natural Resources, Water, Hydrology and Methodology from the Climate Change Office of the Cantu City, and then also Mr. Tran Antoine, Technical Advisor. And it's Mrs. Toa that will start presenting the work of the Cantu City. Please, Mrs. Toa.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Tho. I'm working at the Department of Natural Resources and Environment in Cần Thơ City. I'm honored to be here today, invited by the WWF and OPCC to introduce Cần Thơ City and share our efforts during the OPCC campaign of 2021-2022. Joining me is our technical advisor, Mr. Trần Anh Tuấn, who is supporting the city on carbon inventory. Thank you for having us, and we look forward to the lecture session. Yeah.
Yes, please.
For largest city in Vietnam, the largest city along the Mekong Delta region, with area about 1,439 square kilometers. Population more than 1.3 million people. The city is facing many dangerous.
Excuse me, Mr. Toa, is it possible to get a little bit closer to the microphone, because we're hearing you a bit distant? I think that would be super.
Yeah.
Kỳ âm thanh nghe nhỏ vào điện thoại.
Yeah, I'm second. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Listen me.
Yes, that's very much better. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Cần Thơ City is facing many dangerous caused by climate change, such as high temperature, flooding, riverbank erosion, thunderstorm, and salinization. In which urban flooding and bank erosion are two serious problems in Cần Thơ City. Climate change scenario 2016 to 2099, temperature increased 1.2 to 2.6 degrees. 55% area rose with 100 centimeters sea level rising, with up 5 centimeters. Cần Thơ authority has approved the action plan to respond to climate change for the period 2021 to 2030, with a vision to the 2050. In 2022, Cần Thơ entered the final round of OPCC along with 74 other cities around the globe. Cần Thơ, along with 32 other countries, participate in the Velocity campaign in 2022. Yeah, please, next slide. I would like to share the action plan Yeah, we have 7 action plans such as improving credit stability in the sector reform, pricing harmony, and capacity officers, civil servants, public employees in the responding to climate change. Building disaster-resistant infrastructure, action for the reducing ESG emission in health sector. We're focusing on developing and improving healthcare at grassroots and community level, improving the quality and diversifying the industry. The final reason and empowering and attracting foreign investment capital to respond to climate change. Next, Mr. Trần Anh Lính, who is supporting Cần City to make carbon inventory, will talk about how to do climate important calculation. Please.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Thor, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Next, I would like to talk about 3 typical cases in Cần City regarding the calculation of GHG emission reduction. For the power savings, the calculation of GHG emission reduction is quite simple. It results from an amount of power savings in a megawatt hour in 1 year multiplied by emission factor of the national grid power. For the renewable energy development, such as solar power, wind power, waste to energy, etc. The GHG emission reduction is calculated in 3 steps. Firstly, we calculate the GHG emission of a renewable energy in megawatt hour generated by a renewable energy in 1 year. In the second step, we calculate the GHG emission of national grid power out of megawatt hour generated by a renewable energy in 1 year. Thirdly, we deduct the GHG emission of the national grid power from GHG emission of a new renewable energy. And the relevant emission factors I have just mentioned above were developed by the Electricity Corporation of Vietnam in 2020. And next slide, please. Thank you. For the non-vehicle transport, the calculation is a bit more complicated. It results from the number of different types of vehicle multiplied by the fuel consumption in 1 year, multiplied by the length of pedestrian zone, and finally multiplied by emission factors of fuel use. And in this case, we use emission factors of the IPCC because Vietnam doesn't have the emission factor yet. Until now, we have calculated the GHG emission reduction for ACTs in Vietnam, and more of them are located in central Vietnam. So we have 2 important tips for the calculation of the GHG emission reductions. Tip number 1, we should try to find a simple way for the calculation. As you are aware, any calculations of GHG emission in general always have a high uncertainty. Tip number 2, in the event your country doesn't have a specific emission factor, you are supposed to use an emission factor of other countries that have a socio-economic situation similar to your country. I mean, you should use the emission factor of the IPCC as the final option. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Then I will talk about why we do the impact calculation. In fact, we do it to report our GHG emission reduction with the One Planet City Challenge program and to fulfill our implementation plan of Paris Agreement and our 5-year action plan in responding to climate change. Recently, we have used the methods for calculating the GHG emission reduction of 11 programs, plans, and projects in the country city. In short, I have to say that the calculation of GHG emission reduction helps a lot to promote the renewable energy development. It also assists Vietnam in moving toward the net zero by 2050, as committed by our Prime Minister at COP26. And last but not least, it helps Vietnam to get ready for the establishment of a carbon market by 2028, and decided by our national government recently. Okay, thank you for your listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Tuan and Mrs. Tua. Very interesting and very impressive to see that you have done such a lot of calculations of many different kind of actions in different sectors. So congratulations to that. Have you and I recognize the tips you give us here, that as for example, for on the that it is tricky sometimes, and that you have a big uncertainty. Certainly, yes. Have you? What is your experience? Have you been redoing calculations? Have you been doing calculations for maybe a few years ago and then come back and see how is the calculation more or less good, or what is your, do you have any experience on that?
Yes, thank you for your question. You know, we have started to make the GHG inventory since 2015. I mean, 8 years ago. Yeah, we firstly we started to do it in the central Vietnam, and we did it for the Viet city. I mean, 5 years ago, and I recognize that the uncertainty is very high because first we call us the emission factor. We use emission factor of IPCC, but at that time, 8 years ago, the emission factors, most of them are applied for European country, not, you know, Southeast Asian country like Vietnam. So
right,
it's quite different. For example, you know, for the train, well, we our Vietnam train are using the diesel. I mean the fuel. It's quite different from the European train that using electricity.
Yeah,
you know, so it's quite different in terms of many emission factors. So I think right now Vietnamese the government have just announced emission factors. So I think the uncertainty will reduce.
Right.
Yeah, in the next few years, because they just the national government just issued 2 months ago the emission factors for Vietnam. I mean the specific for Vietnam country. So it's quite different, and it's maybe a little bit higher as compared to the emission factors of IPCC, because you know our technology, our techniques, not up to date as compared to European countries. So the emission higher is higher. So we are trying, you know, to persuade to convince the central, the national government Now try to issue more and more emission factors to reduce the uncertainty in our calculation.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. That's very interesting to see also the that things develop, and you need, of course, it's very much better with local or regional data, and it's good to hear that there is a dialogue with local and national government to improve conditions to calculate things. Thanks a lot so far.
Björn, we had a question for you from Berna Yilmaz from the city of Denizli in Turkey. And they're wondering whether they can use the guide you referred to for calculating the organization's greenhouse gas emissions.
That is another standard. And sometimes it can be similar method, but there are different system boundaries. So you will need to be mindful about the different system boundaries when calculating a organization's emission reductions and the city community emission reductions. Yes.
Okay, great. Please go ahead and post questions in the chat. I'm also very impressed by Cantu City's example, and I find it very encouraging to see these developments. Also, I must say I was a little bit taken aback by the fact that over half of the city risks to be flooded with the prognosed sea level rise. So that's certainly a wake-up call, I think, as well.
Yeah, very clearly with the low-lying city and so on. So it's a major climate hazard for you. I will, what do you say, Victoria? I have a few slides to wrap up things, and then we can take more questions and thoughts.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, post your questions in the chat if you have them. That's really good.
Right. As Mr. Tuan was saying, it is a little bit more tricky, but you can do it to calculate actions when coming to biking, walking, and promoting non-motorist transportation. We would like to highlight that there is a tool that is quite simple to use from the World Health Organization. It's free to use, and it can be used to get a first overview of the impact of greenhouse gas emissions from doing actions to promoting walk or biking. And you will also get the health impact and health impact translated into economic value of premature mortality, exposure to air pollution, and traffic crashes. It is, I find it easy to work with, and I think even with a basic knowledge on transportation things and data and so on, you can work with it. You can work with general figures, or if you have city specific. The emission factors, however, just be mindful, is from the vehicles cannot be changed in this edition of the tool, might be different in future. So the greenhouse gases is on a general global level, but I think it works more or less fine in this aspect for most cities. And at least it will give you a good idea of the magnitude. And the interesting thing with the tool is that you will not only get the direct emissions from the fuel used, but you can also include emissions from the fuel production, like scope 3 that we said, and even the scope 3 emissions from the production of the vehicle itself. And that's of course interesting. So you can find it at heatwalkingcycling.org, free to use. And I would like to add I see what is our time here a little bit. There are, for those who are new to calculating or want to take further steps to develop your calculations, there are a lot of resources and tools out there. And it's, I would say that the Global Covenant of Mayors have a very, nowadays, a very elaborated and easy to find resource library. You can see it to the right, and you can find both tools, case studies, and publications. And it's you can find resources for the different steps that you are in your work. So you can sort, for example, on action planning, and you will have resources for how to do your action planning and calculating actions. Otherwise, of course, there is a don't be shy to reach out and take help. I find it useful, of course, if you are a climate specialist, work together with transportation specialists or energy specialists, and together I think you can make some progress. I find universities often helpful. Of course, if you have the money, you can take the help of consultancies or digital tools in this area. Some are free, some cost some money. So these are some of the ideas. I would say, to summarize a little bit and final words, of course, don't forget to summarize your actions that you have calculated, 1, 2, 3, to see how much more do we need to do to close the gap to your target. And think twice, don't double count. For example, don't account for energy efficient action and renewable energy action at the same time. You have to do the calculation of one of the actions first. But the tricky thing is, of course, depending on what action you calculate first, the impact will be different for each action. So be mindful about how you do that. But anyway, I would say just do it. It's better to get started, to get some figures. It's better with some figures than no figures. If you have some figures, then you can be challenged, you can discuss with other people, and yourself can start improving the figures. So, and ask for help, cooperate, exchange ideas, and good luck.
Björn, I have a question here. I think we had an important reflection here from Trent1 that renewable energy does have some emissions from the production line. And so I was wondering how that compares with the system boundaries. Is there a comparability issue there if you have coal power plants that are in use right now and you compare that to a sort of whole life cycle emissions from the renewables, or what do you think about that?
I think in general, it is good to consider the whole chain of impacts and what is happening in for each action. So in the case of energy production, it is good to evaluate, if you want to do the action, it is important to evaluate the whole chain of what is happening, and emissions and other impacts from the production of material, the transportation, the actual emissions, and everything that is going around there. To be aware of conflict of interests, to be aware of co-benefits and so on. Then how you calculate it, if you have figures, that's fine for the whole chain. That's very good. But again, think about what do you have in your emission inventory. So don't go outside of that boundary. So if you, and then again, if you have a emission inventory with a small scope, then you might want to expand the scope of your emission inventory to be able to include more of the emissions from the action. I don't know if that is making any sense, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Björn, because I know we had a very important example that misguided the Swedish public when one institute calculated the whole production of the battery for an electric vehicle and compared that to tailpipe emissions from a gasoline car, which didn't really make sense. So it's quite important to consider, I think, those system boundaries, but of course all renewables and all products will continue to have emissions at some point. So thank you, Trent, for that reflection, because that's quite important.
It can be in any way. We don't want to have fossil fuel cars, so we need to take away that. So the alternative is not to continue with fossil fuel cars, but the alternative is to improve electrical cars and other ways of transportation.
Good. We're nearing the full hour now. And so thank you everyone for coming here today. We hope that this has been valuable to you. This will also be put on our YouTube channel in case you want to go back and figure something out. And we will send out slides as well for those of you who want that. It may be that your local WWF office will offer group-based coaching on both science-based targets and calculating emissions reductions from actions. And in that case, you will be able to sit down in a smaller group to reflect upon these topics and get a bit of further help from peers and from WWF staff. We're happy to stay behind for a few minutes more in case you have questions that you want to ask. So feel free to hang in here because we really want to connect with you. But thank you so much, and I wish you a nice and wonderful day wherever you are in the world.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. And thank you, Kanto City. I think if people still are out there, there is a question from Davao City about standard that
Yes,
is
about the
yeah.
emissions inventory. Yes, I see that.
I don't know, of course, anything about, but the idea is, of course, I'm pretty sure that is extremely fine to use that, and that you are developing something appropriate to the Philippines. So no, that'd be fine. I think our message is, as long as you know what you're doing and that you work with the same boundaries for the emission inventory as for the actions, that is fine.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Right.
Thank you for asking.
Right. Well, next time.